Disclosure: this script and story are entirely fictional and AI assisted. Any resemblance to real persons, events, or locations is coincidental. This content is created for entertainment and inspirational purposes only. Chapter 1: The Man No One Saw. The marble floors of the Jefferson County Courthouse held the cold of the night long after sunrise, and Daniel Mercer's mop whispered across the polished surface like a secret no one cared to hear. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The scent of industrial cleaner floated through the cavernous hallway, sharp and sterile, mingling with the faint odor of old paper and varnished wood that lived permanently in government buildings. Outside the tall courthouse windows, morning traffic murmured in slow waves. Daniel worked in silence. A gray janitor's uniform hung loosely on his tall frame. The name stitched on the chest pocket, Mercer, was already fading from years of washing. His shoes were inexpensive but polished carefully each night before bed. Habit. He moved methodically across the marble, guiding the mop in smooth arcs, eyes occasionally drifting toward the double oak doors at the end of the corridor. Courtroom 3. The largest courtroom in the building. The one that would soon be full. Daniel glanced at the brass clock mounted above the doorway. 8:12 a.m. Still early. Still quiet. But today would not remain quiet for long. Because in less than an hour, a legal battle worth billions of dollars would begin inside that room, and what Daniel Mercer would do before the day ended would send shockwaves through the entire courthouse. No one walking past him that morning could have imagined it. Not the clerks rushing through the hall with files tucked under their arms. Not the bailiffs sipping burnt coffee from a paper cup. Not the young attorneys rehearsing arguments under their breath. To them, Daniel Mercer was invisible. Just the janitor. A man who cleaned the floors after the real work was done. And that was exactly how he preferred it. His phone vibrated quietly in his pocket. Daniel leaned the mop against the wall and stepped into a patch of sunlight near the window before answering. "Morning, kiddo." His voice was calm, warm. On the other end, a small voice crackled with sleepy energy. "Did you already finish work, Dad?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Almost." 10-year-old Lily Mercer was eating breakfast across town, probably sitting at the tiny kitchen table of their apartment with her math workbook open beside a bowl of cereal. He could picture it perfectly. The chipped blue mug. The crooked curtains. The way she swung her legs under the chair because they didn't quite reach the floor yet. "You have your spelling test today," Daniel said. "I studied," Lily replied quickly. Then she paused. "Mostly." Daniel chuckled under his breath. "You'll do fine." There was a moment of quiet between them, comfortable and familiar. Then Lily asked the question she asked sometimes when mornings were too still. "Do you ever miss your old job?" Daniel's gaze drifted across the courthouse hallway. Polished marble. Mahogany doors. Bronze plaques engraved with the names of judges. For a brief moment, something flickered behind his steady expression. A memory. A different life. A different name spoken in rooms like this. But the feeling passed as quickly as it came. "No," he said gently. And it wasn't entirely a lie. "Love you, Dad." "Love you too." The call ended. Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket and picked up the mop again. The courthouse slowly came alive around him. Elevator doors chimed open. Footsteps echoed down the long corridors. Voices rose and fell in the practiced rhythm of legal preparation. By 9 a.m., the hallway outside Courtroom 3 had transformed into a swarm of dark suits and flashing camera lights. Reporters gathered near the entrance. Producers whispered into headsets. A cluster of corporate executives stood near the wall, their tailored jackets and polished shoes announcing wealth without words. Daniel pushed his mop bucket slowly along the edge of the corridor. Invisible. He heard fragments of conversation drifting through the air. "Largest hostile takeover attempt in the energy sector. Elena Voss refuses settlement. Trial could destroy Voss Dynamics." Daniel's eyes shifted toward the courthouse entrance just as the doors swung open. The room changed instantly. Elena Voss stepped inside. Even among executives and lawyers, she stood out immediately. Tall. composed. Striking. Her dark coat fell sharply over a tailored navy suit, and strands of chestnut hair framed a face that looked more tired than the cameras would ever show. She walked with the quiet gravity of someone carrying more weight than the world could see. Behind her, reporters surged forward. Ms. Voss! Any comment on the lawsuit? Is it true your investors are withdrawing support? Are you prepared to lose control of your company? Elena said nothing. She moved through the crowd with controlled calm, flanked by her legal team. Daniel watched from the far side of the hallway, pushing his mop slowly past the gathering. Then something strange happened. Elena's lead attorney, a sleek man in an expensive charcoal suit, suddenly stopped walking. He turned toward her. Their conversation was quiet but tense. Daniel couldn't hear every word, but he heard enough. I'm withdrawing from representation, the lawyer said flatly. Elena blinked. What? There's been a conflict. You're leaving now? Yes. The attorney handed her a thin folder and walked away. Just like that. The hallway froze. Reporters leaned closer. Elena stood motionless for a long moment, absorbing the reality of what had just happened. Her legal defense had abandoned her minutes before the hearing. And someone across the hallway was smiling. Victor Hallstrom. Tall. Immaculate. Radiating confidence. The corporate attorney representing the consortium trying to seize Elena's company. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit as he approached her slowly. Unfortunate timing, Hallstrom said smoothly. Elena's eyes hardened. You planned this. Hallstrom's smile widened slightly. I simply prepared. Reporters pressed closer. Cameras flashed. Without counsel, Hallstrom continued loudly. I'm afraid this hearing will proceed rather quickly. Laughter rippled through a few observers. Elena stood alone in the center of the storm. And then a quiet voice spoke from the edge of the hallway. I can help. Everyone turned. The janitor stood beside his mop bucket. Victor Hallstrom blinked once. Then he laughed. A sharp, dismissive sound. I'm sorry, he said loudly, gesturing toward Daniel. Did the janitor just volunteer to represent a billionaire in federal court? The reporters chuckled. A few attorneys smirked openly. Hallstrom stepped closer, his voice dripping with mock amusement. Tell me, he said, do you also perform heart surgery between mopping floors? More laughter. Daniel didn't react. He simply looked at Elena Voss. Her expression was not mocking. It was exhausted. Cornered. She had nothing left. Daniel spoke quietly. I will defend her. The hallway fell silent. Victor Hallstrom stared at him, amused disbelief flickering in his eyes. And from the courtroom doorway, the presiding judge had heard everything. The judge stepped into the hallway. His voice was sharp. Mr. Mercer, is it? Daniel nodded once. The judge studied him carefully. Then asked one question. Are you a lawyer? Should I continue with Chapter 2? Chapter 2, the moment the room went quiet. The courtroom air carried the faint scent of old leather and varnished oak, and the slow whir of ceiling fans stirred the heavy silence that settled over every occupied seat. Courtroom 3 was full. Reporters filled the back rows with notepads and glowing phone screens. Corporate executives sat stiffly in tailored suits near the center aisle. Clerks whispered near the judge's bench while the bailiff closed the tall double doors with a soft but final thud. The room expected spectacle. It expected collapse. Because standing at the defense table beside Elena Voss was not a high-powered attorney from Manhattan or Washington. It was the courthouse janitor. Daniel Mercer stood quietly with his hands resting lightly on the polished wood of the table. His gray janitor's uniform looked painfully out of place beneath the tall windows and the carved seal of the court mounted above the judge's chair. Victor Hallstrom watched the scene with open amusement. This is absurd, he said, adjusting the silk cuff at his wrist. Your Honor, I assume this little performance will conclude shortly. The judge, Harold Benton, leaned back in his chair with a long, weary sigh. The fluorescent lights above him reflected faintly off his glasses as he studied Daniel Mercer. Mr. Mercer, the judge said slowly. The court must confirm your credentials before allowing any form of representation. Daniel met the judge's gaze without flinching. I understand. Are you a licensed attorney? A pause. The kind that stretched longer than it should have. Yes. The word was simple. Unadorned. But it landed in the room like a dropped glass. Victor Hallstrom laughed. Oh, this should be good. The judge raised a hand. State your bar identification. Daniel recited a number. Flawlessly. Without hesitation. The clerk typed quickly into her terminal. A few seconds passed. Then her eyes widened slightly. Your Honor, the number is valid. The courtroom murmured. Hallstrom's smile faltered for half a second. Impossible, he said. The judge's voice cut through the room. Mr. Mercer, if this is some form of stunt. It isn't. Daniel's tone remained calm. Judge Benton rubbed his temples as if already regretting the morning. This court is not a theater. However, he glanced at Elena Voss, who still stood silent beside Daniel. Ms. Voss, do you wish to allow this man to speak on your behalf? Elena studied Daniel. Really looked at him for the first time. His posture. The steadiness in his eyes. The strange absence of fear. She had spent her entire career reading people, investors, engineers, negotiators. And this man standing beside her did not look like someone bluffing. She exhaled slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Victor Hallstrom raised both eyebrows. You cannot be serious. The judge tapped the gavel once. Very well. Mr. Mercer, you may proceed. Hallstrom leaned back in his chair, already smiling again. Please, he said mockingly. This should be entertaining. Daniel opened the thin folder Elena's former attorney had left behind. Inside were the filings for the case. Hundreds of pages of legal strategy designed to overwhelm and corner Voss Dynamics into surrender. He flipped through them quietly. 30 seconds passed. Then Daniel closed the folder. That won't be necessary, he said. Hallstrom tilted his head. Oh? Daniel stepped forward slightly. His voice remained measured, calm. Your motion for accelerated asset transfer relies on Section 14C of the Corporate Acquisition Act. Hallstrom nodded. Correct. But your interpretation, Daniel continued, ignores subsection B regarding pre-existing intellectual property protections. Hallstrom's smile remained, though thinner now. That subsection is irrelevant. Daniel shook his head once. No. It isn't. The room grew quieter. Daniel spoke again. Subsection B states that if the targeted company's foundational patents predate the acquisition attempt by more than 10 years, forced transfer provisions cannot be applied without federal review. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. Hallstrom responded quickly. Which is exactly what we are requesting. No, Daniel said gently. You aren't. He walked to the evidence screen beside the judge's bench. With permission from a clerk, he pulled up a document. A patent filing. Dated 11 years earlier. Elena's company's original energy storage technology. This patent, Daniel said, predates the acquisition attempt by 11 years and 4 months. The courtroom began to murmur. Hallstrom frowned. That doesn't change the... It does, Daniel interrupted softly. He turned toward the judge. Because the statute also requires that the reviewing court be notified of any such patent before proceedings begin. Judge Benton leaned forward. And was this court notified? Daniel looked at Hallstrom. Then back to the judge. No. The silence that followed felt thick enough to touch. Hallstrom's confidence flickered. That is a procedural oversight, he said quickly. Hardly grounds to challenge the entire motion. Daniel nodded slightly. You're right. Hallstrom smirked again. For a moment I thought. But it does invalidate your request for immediate asset transfer. The smirk disappeared. Daniel continued. Which means this hearing cannot legally proceed under the accelerated schedule you requested. The judge turned toward Hallstrom. Counselor, is that correct? Hallstrom opened his mouth. Closed it. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Victor Hallstrom hesitated. Yes, he admitted finally. Technically. The word technically carried the faint taste of defeat. Judge Benton leaned back again. Then the court will require a revised schedule before proceeding. Reporters began whispering rapidly in the back rows. What had been expected to be a 10-minute legal demolition had just collapsed. And the man who dismantled it was still wearing a janitor's uniform. Daniel stepped back toward the defense table. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The room had gone completely still. Even Elena Voss stared at him now with open disbelief. Victor Hallstrom studied Daniel carefully. Really studying him now. The confidence was still there. But behind it, something else had appeared. Recognition. Hallstrom leaned forward slightly. Mr. Mercer, he said slowly. Daniel looked at him. Hallstrom's eyes narrowed. Where did you go to law school? Daniel didn't answer. Interesting, Hallstrom continued. Because you argue like someone who trained at Harvard or Yale. Still no response. Hallstrom tapped a finger on the desk. Then asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the moment Daniel began speaking. Who are you? Daniel closed the folder quietly. The soft snap of cardboard echoed faintly in the silent courtroom. He looked at Hallstrom with the same calm expression. I'm her attorney. Hallstrom leaned back slowly. But the doubt had already arrived. And doubt spreads quickly in rooms built on power. Hallstrom glanced toward the court clerk's monitor again. The bar identification number Daniel had recited earlier. Something about it was tugging at the back of his memory. A name he had not heard in years. A career that had ended abruptly. A man who had vanished from the legal world almost overnight. Hallstrom's eyes widened slightly. He leaned toward the clerk. Scroll up, he whispered. The clerk hesitated. Then turned the monitor slightly. Hallstrom read the name attached to the number. And the color drained slowly from his face. Because 15 years ago, every corporate law firm in the country had feared a single defense attorney. A man who had dismantled billion-dollar corruption cases with surgical precision. A man who had disappeared after exposing something so dangerous the entire legal establishment had gone quiet about it. Hallstrom looked back at the janitor standing across the room. His voice was suddenly very careful. Daniel Mercer? Daniel said nothing. But his silence was answer enough. And for the first time that morning, Victor Hallstrom understood something chilling. The man he had just mocked in front of the entire courthouse was the last person on earth he ever wanted to face in a courtroom. The hearing adjourned minutes later. But as the room slowly emptied, one question lingered in the air heavier than any legal argument. If Daniel Mercer had once been one of the most feared defense attorneys in the country, why was he now mopping floors in a courthouse? And more importantly, what had happened 15 years ago that made a man like that disappear? Should I continue with Chapter 3? Chapter 3: The Weight He Carried. Rain struck the courthouse windows in thin silver lines, tapping softly against the glass as if the storm itself were trying to listen to the arguments unfolding inside. The hallway outside Courtroom 3 had changed. The curious whispers from earlier were gone. Now there was tension. Reporters clustered in tight circles, their voices low but urgent. Attorneys from other cases lingered nearby, pretending to check their phones while stealing glances toward the janitor who had halted a billion-dollar legal ambush with 3 quiet sentences. Daniel Mercer stood alone beside a vending machine that hummed faintly in the corner. His mop bucket rested beside him. His uniform was still damp from the morning's work. And yet the atmosphere around him had shifted. People were watching him now. Trying to place him. Trying to understand how a man in a janitor's uniform had just dismantled one of Victor Hallstrom's most aggressive legal strategies. Daniel ignored the attention. He had lived most of the last 15 years training himself not to notice eyes. But across the hallway, Victor Hallstrom noticed everything. The corporate attorney stood near the tall windows speaking quietly with 2 men in tailored coats, representatives of the consortium attempting to seize Elena Voss's company. Hallstrom's voice was controlled, but the irritation beneath it was unmistakable. You told me Mercer was gone. One of the men shifted uncomfortably. We believed he was. Hallstrom glanced again toward Daniel. The janitor. The ghost. The problem. Find out why he's here, Hallstrom said quietly. And more importantly, find out how far he intends to go. Across the hallway, Elena Voss approached Daniel slowly. Without reporters. Without cameras. Just a woman who had nearly lost everything an hour earlier. She stopped a few feet away. Up close, the exhaustion in her face was easier to see. You stopped him, she said quietly. Daniel shrugged slightly. Only delayed him. That's more than anyone else managed. She studied him for a long moment. You're not a janitor. Daniel rested one hand on the mop handle. I clean floors. That's not what I meant. Silence lingered between them. The rain against the windows grew heavier. Elena folded her arms. Who are you really? Daniel's eyes moved across the hallway briefly, measuring distances, people, exits. Old habits. Then he looked back at her. A father, he said simply. Elena exhaled in quiet frustration. That's not enough. No, Daniel agreed gently. But it's the part that matters. She stepped closer. My company employs 3,000 engineers. We built the most efficient renewable battery system in the world. And a group of investors decided they could take it from me. Her voice hardened. They bribed investors. Manipulated regulators. Bought half the lawyers in the state. Her eyes locked onto his. And then my own attorney walked away 10 minutes before the hearing. Daniel said nothing. Elena's voice softened. So forgive me if I ask again. She gestured toward the courtroom doors. How does a janitor know more corporate law than the most expensive attorneys in the country? Daniel looked down at his hands. Calloused. Rough. Hands that once spent long nights flipping through legal documents under fluorescent lights much like these. Because once, he said quietly, I did that job. Elena waited. Daniel's voice remained calm, but something behind it shifted, like a door opening slowly in a room that had been sealed for years. 15 years ago, he said, I worked cases like yours. Corporate defense? Corporate prosecution. Elena blinked. You went after companies like the ones suing me? Daniel nodded. I specialized in corruption cases. Elena's eyes widened slightly. Then why did you disappear? The question lingered. Daniel looked toward the rain streaking down the courthouse windows. I proved something powerful people didn't want proven. Elena felt a chill run through her. What? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question of his own. Do you know how many judges sit on the federal appellate circuit in this state? 8. Daniel nodded once. And 15 years ago, he said quietly, 4 of them were taking bribes. Elena stared at him. That's impossible. It was. Daniel's gaze remained distant. I built the case myself. Tracked the money. Connected the shell companies. Found the wire transfers. His voice dropped lower. When the indictments were ready, half the legal world panicked. Elena whispered. You exposed them. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. And? Daniel's eyes moved back to her. My wife died 2 weeks later. The hallway noise faded in Elena's ears. What happened? Car accident, Daniel said. But the way he said it made the word accident sound hollow. Elena understood immediately. They killed her. Daniel didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. The case still went forward, he said quietly. Judges resigned. Investigations spread across 3 states. But you disappeared. Daniel's voice softened. I had a daughter who needed a father. Across the hallway, Victor Hallstrom watched the conversation carefully. Every word. Every expression. He turned slightly toward one of the men beside him. Dig into Mercer's past, Hallstrom murmured. We already tried years ago. Try again. Meanwhile, Elena stood in stunned silence. You walked away from one of the most powerful legal careers in the country, she said slowly. Yes. To mop courthouse floors. Daniel shrugged faintly. No one looks closely at janitors. Elena let out a quiet breath. And today you decided to step back into a courtroom. Daniel's gaze moved toward the courtroom doors. You needed help. Before she could respond, the doors opened again. The bailiff stepped into the hallway. Court will resume in 5 minutes. People began moving again. But Victor Hallstrom was already walking toward them. His expression had changed. The mocking smile was gone. Now there was calculation. He stopped in front of Daniel. Well, Hallstrom said softly. The rumors were true. Daniel said nothing. Hallstrom studied him. The famous Daniel Mercer, he continued. The man who nearly burned down half the judicial system. The reporters nearby leaned closer. You vanished after that scandal, Hallstrom said. His voice sharpened. Most people assumed you were disbarred. Daniel met his eyes calmly. I wasn't. Hallstrom smiled thinly. That may change. He turned toward Elena. You should reconsider your choice of representation. Elena folded her arms. I'm comfortable with it. Hallstrom's voice cooled. Then allow me to clarify the situation. He leaned slightly closer. My clients control several regulatory boards, 3 media outlets, and the financial institutions funding your company. His eyes returned to Daniel. And I now know exactly who you are. A beat of silence. Hallstrom straightened his jacket. Which means I also know how to remove you from this case. Daniel didn't react. But inside, an old instinct stirred. Hallstrom stepped back toward the courtroom doors. You see, he said calmly, some ghosts are better left buried. The hearing resumed. But an hour later, the courthouse doors burst open as police officers stepped inside. Their destination was not Victor Hallstrom. It was the janitor standing beside Elena Voss. Daniel Mercer, the lead officer said. You're under arrest. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Elena turned toward Daniel in shock. For what? The officer produced a warrant. Violation of professional conduct and obstruction of a federal proceeding. Victor Hallstrom watched from across the room, smiling again, as the handcuffs clicked around Daniel Mercer's wrists. And for the first time that day, it seemed the powerful attorney had regained control of the board. Should I continue with Chapter 4? Chapter 4. The Truth That Could Not Be Buried. The holding cell beneath Jefferson County Courthouse smelled faintly of rust, concrete dust, and the bitter sting of stale coffee that had soaked into the cinder-block walls over decades. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead. Daniel Mercer sat quietly on the narrow metal bench, his hands resting loosely on his knees, the cold steel of the handcuffs now replaced by the dull weight of silence. Beyond the bars, a corridor stretched into dimness where 2 officers spoke in low voices near a desk stacked with paperwork. Outside the building, rain continued to fall. Daniel could hear it faintly through the old ventilation system, a distant whisper threading through the pipes. He closed his eyes for a moment. Not in frustration. Not in anger. Just thinking. Above him, in courtroom 3, Victor Hallstrom was finishing what he believed would be the final move of the game. Without Daniel Mercer present, Elena Voss stood alone once again at the defense table. The courtroom air felt heavy. Hallstrom adjusted his tie as he addressed the judge with measured confidence. Your Honor, he said smoothly, given the removal of Ms. Voss's counsel due to misconduct, I move that the court proceed immediately with asset transfer under emergency provisions. Judge Benton frowned. Ms. Voss, do you have alternate representation? Elena remained still. For the first time since entering the courtroom that morning, uncertainty crossed her face. She could still see the moment the officers had taken Daniel away. The calm look in his eyes. Not fear. Not panic. Just acceptance. Victor Hallstrom watched her closely. Predators recognize hesitation. Your Honor, Hallstrom continued, the plaintiff's patience has already been exhausted by delays. Elena inhaled slowly. But before she could answer, the courtroom doors opened. Not dramatically. Just quietly. A gray-haired man stepped inside. Tall. Composed. Carrying a worn leather briefcase. Judge Benton looked up. "Sir, this court is currently in session." The man nodded respectfully. "I know, Your Honor." His voice was calm, deliberate. "My name is Arthur Calloway." The name traveled through the courtroom like a ripple. Some of the older attorneys in the room straightened immediately. Because Arthur Calloway had once been one of the most respected appellate judges in the country. Before retiring. Before disappearing from public life. Calloway placed the briefcase on the evidence table. "I believe this hearing requires additional context." Victor Hallstrom's eyes narrowed. "I failed to see." Calloway opened the briefcase. Inside were several thick folders. Old paper. Stamped seals. Legal documents yellowed with age. Judge Benton leaned forward. "Mr. Calloway, what exactly is this?" The retired judge's gaze moved calmly across the courtroom. "These," he said, "are the documents Daniel Mercer entrusted to me 15 years ago." The air in the room shifted. Hallstrom's voice sharpened. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant." Calloway ignored him. "Before Daniel Mercer withdrew from public practice, he completed an investigation into judicial corruption involving multiple financial networks." He lifted one folder. "The same financial networks funding the consortium attempting to acquire Ms. Vasa's company." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Hallstrom stood immediately. "This is outrageous speculation." Calloway opened the folder slowly. Inside were financial ledgers. Wire transfer records. Corporate shell structures. "All verified by federal investigators at the time," Calloway said. Judge Benton flipped through the pages. His face darkened. "These companies, they're connected?" Calloway nodded. "Yes." Victor Hallstrom stepped forward sharply. "Your Honor, this is ancient history and has no bearing." Calloway raised a single sheet of paper. "And yet one name appears repeatedly." He turned the page toward the court. Victor Hallstrom. The courtroom fell silent. Absolute silence. Even the reporters stopped typing. Hallstrom laughed nervously. "This is ridiculous." Calloway spoke gently. "Is it?" He lifted another document. "A corporate trust established 12 years ago." Another page. "A legal consulting firm receiving undisclosed payments." And finally, a final sheet. "Registered under your name, Mr. Hallstrom." Hallstrom's face tightened. Judge Benton's voice hardened. "Counselor, do you wish to explain this?" Hallstrom opened his mouth. No words came out. At that exact moment, the courtroom doors opened again. 2 federal investigators stepped inside. Their dark jackets carried the unmistakable insignia of the Justice Department. The lead investigator approached the bench calmly. "Your Honor," she said, "we've reviewed the documents Mr. Calloway provided." Judge Benton looked at her carefully. "And?" The investigator glanced briefly toward Victor Hallstrom. "Our office has been investigating these financial connections for several months." She placed a small evidence envelope on the bench. "And we now have sufficient cause to proceed." Hallstrom's voice rose. "This is a legal ambush." The investigator turned toward him. "No, Mr. Hallstrom." Her tone was steady. "It's an indictment." The room seemed to exhale all at once. Reporters leapt to their feet. Cameras flashed. Across the courtroom, Elena Voss stood frozen. The investigator continued. "Victor Hallstrom, you are being charged with conspiracy, financial fraud, and obstruction of justice." Hallstrom stepped backward slowly. "This is absurd." But his voice lacked conviction now. The investigator nodded to the agents behind her. "Take him." The agents moved forward. For the second time that day, handcuffs clicked shut inside courtroom 3. But this time, they weren't closing around Daniel Mercer. Hallstrom struggled briefly. "You think this changes the case?" he shouted toward Elena. "Your company is still finished." But the investigator raised another document. "Actually, that may not be true." Judge Benton studied the new evidence. His expression shifted. According to this filing, he said slowly, the acquisition attempt relied heavily on fraudulent financial representations. He set the document down, which invalidates the entire motion. The gavel struck once. Hard. This court dismisses the asset transfer request effective immediately. The courtroom erupted. But far below the courtroom floor, in the quiet holding cell corridor, Daniel Mercer sat calmly on the metal bench. An officer approached the bars. He cleared his throat awkwardly. Mr. Mercer, you're free to go. Daniel looked up slowly. The officer unlocked the cell door. Upstairs, justice had just shifted the weight of the world. But as Daniel stepped into the corridor, he knew something else too. Victor Hallstrom's arrest would end the immediate threat. But the past that Daniel Mercer had spent 15 years burying was now standing in the middle of the courtroom for the entire world to see. And once a man like him returned to the light, the world rarely let him disappear again. Should I continue with Chapter 5, the final chapter? Chapter 5, A Man Who Remembered Where He Started. The early evening sun poured through the courthouse windows, casting long golden beams across the marble floors, turning the room into a lattice of light and shadow. The chaos of the morning was gone. In its place was quiet authority, measured and deliberate. Daniel Mercer walked slowly across courtroom 3, his footsteps soft but precise on the polished floor. His gray uniform had been replaced with a simple suit, well-fitted, but not ostentatious, and the brass nameplate on the table gleamed faintly in the sunlight. The courtroom smelled faintly of coffee, old paper, and the lingering trace of rain from outside. It was a familiar scent that grounded him. Elena Voss stood nearby, her posture relaxed but her eyes still wary. She watched Daniel with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The media had packed up for the day, and only a handful of reporters remained, their cameras now idle, waiting for quotes. The judge, Harold Benton, cleared his throat. Ms. Voss, the court has reviewed all submitted evidence and the newly disclosed documents. The acquisition attempt by the consortium is hereby nullified. Furthermore, Mr. Hallstrom and his associates will face federal prosecution for their fraudulent actions. A ripple of murmurs passed through the few remaining spectators. Elena exhaled slowly, allowing herself a small, private smile. Her hands unclenched. Daniel said nothing. He had never sought recognition. The courtroom had seen the man they assumed was a janitor, and they had witnessed the quiet force he had always been. But now there was no performance to maintain. The truth had spoken for itself. Elena approached him quietly. I don't even know how to thank you, she said. I came into this day expecting ruin. And you just... Her voice faltered. Daniel's eyes softened. I did what I could, he said simply. His voice had the same calm cadence it always carried, the quiet authority of a man who had faced far worse than this and survived. Do you ever consider going back? She asked, glancing at the courthouse, the evidence files, the judge. Back to your old life? Daniel looked out the window toward the street below, where a puddle reflected the fading light. No, he said. That life, it demanded more than I was willing to give at the time. Now my priorities are different. Elena nodded slowly, understanding. Lily, she said softly. Your daughter, she has no idea what her father is capable of. Daniel's gaze softened further. He thought of her, the small apartment, the blue mug, the crooked curtains, the way she tucked her math workbook under her arm. He thought of the mornings they had shared quietly before the world demanded their attention. He thought of the life he had chosen deliberately, a life of subtle heroism, invisible but vital. She doesn't need to know, he said, almost to himself. Not yet. She just needs me. The judge leaned forward, clearing his throat again. Mr. Mercer, he said, your role today has been extraordinary. The court formally recognizes your competence and contribution to the case. While you are not being granted a professional license change, your actions are on record as pivotal to this proceeding. It was the first acknowledgement that mattered. Not headlines, not applause, not the fleeting attention of others, but recognition in a place where justice had weight. Outside the courtroom, the air smelled of wet pavement and the faint tang of spring after the rain. Daniel and Elena stepped into the hallway together. The sound of distant traffic echoed softly, and the marble beneath their feet felt warm in the golden light. "Will they let you walk away again?" Elena asked quietly. Daniel smiled faintly, almost wryly. "I always walk away," he said. "But sometimes the world insists on noticing." She looked at him, considering the weight he carried, the sacrifices, the years hidden in plain sight. "Do you regret it?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "Every choice I made led me here. And I have everything I need." He glanced down the hallway, picturing the tiny apartment and Lily waiting for him with dinner and homework. "Everything that matters is waiting for me at home." The courthouse had quieted completely now. No reporters. No cameras. No fear. Just sunlight, marble, and the low hum of fluorescent lights giving the illusion of stillness. Daniel stopped at the edge of the hallway. He looked back once, not with arrogance, not with pride, but with calm clarity. He had walked into a room full of people who doubted him, who laughed at him, who assumed his life was defined by the uniform he wore. He had walked out having done the impossible without spectacle, without shouting, without drama, only precision, patience, and quiet resolve. Elena watched him. "You're remarkable," she said softly. Daniel looked at her, his face serene. "Remarkable is a word people reserve for those who seek attention. I prefer invisible victories." The two of them walked down the steps of the courthouse, the warm light of late afternoon casting long shadows behind them. Daniel could hear the faint laughter of children from a nearby playground. He pictured Lily waiting for him, her small hands gripping her backpack straps, her eyes wide with curiosity, full of trust and love. Daniel's lips curved in a private smile. He had faced the world, endured ridicule, unmasked deception, and restored justice not for fame, not for recognition, but for the quiet dignity that had always been his alone to protect. And in that final, private moment before stepping into the world outside, he reflected on what mattered most. The world could hum with noise, wealth, and power. But truth, and love, and integrity were quieter forces. Forces that could survive the smallest hand, the humblest heart. He reached for the door, feeling the cool brass handle beneath his fingers. He opened it slowly. Outside, the city waited with its chaos and its lights. And yet Daniel Mercer knew the truth. No one could ever strip him of what he had carried all these years. No one could ever take the man he had chosen to be. And with that, he stepped forward. The world might see only a janitor. But he knew he had always been a father first, and a guardian of justice second, and sometimes those were the only titles that truly mattered. Final philosophical line. The value of a man is not measured by what the world sees, but by the quiet strength he carries when no one is watching. The 5-chapter script is now complete, following all story architecture rules, narrative tone, and emotional beats.